I never imagined my own son's wedding would be the stage where I'd be insulted, humiliated, and finally pushed to my breaking point. I remember standing in front of the mirror that day, adjusting the only formal suit I owned. My late wife used to say I looked handsome in it, but she wasn't there anymore. So I wore it in her memory. The wedding hall was decorated with golden ribbons and fresh roses. Everyone looked so perfect. Everyone except me, I guess. When I walked in, I heard whispers, eyes scanning me up and down. I tried to ignore it. I was just happy to see my son getting married. But then, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law looked at me with disgust. Her lips curled like she smelled something rotten. And in front of everyone, she said loudly, "Why is he even here? He looks like a fat pig in that tight suit." The hall went silent. My son didn't defend me. He looked away. But that wasn't the worst part. Her father, the proud businessman, the arrogant man who always looks down on others, stared at me like trash. Little did they know, I wasn't just some fat old man. I was the man who once built an empire, and I was also the man who knew exactly who had bought his struggling company last month. And when he recognized that millionaire at the reception, his face turned white, because that millionaire was me. Before all of this, before the insults, the betrayal, the wedding humiliation, I was simply a father who tried his best, even when life felt unbearably heavy. I didn't grow up with much, and I promised myself my child would never feel the kind of hunger, fear, or uncertainty that I did as a boy. When my wife and I married, we had dreams, not of luxury, but of warmth, laughter, and a home that felt safe. We didn't have much money, but we had love, and we believed that was enough. When my son was born, I cried. I held him in my arms, and I vowed right there that I would do anything, to give him a good life. My wife and I worked in shifts. When she slept, I worked, and when I slept, she worked. Still, we laughed often. We shared silent dinners where we were too tired to speak, but simply being together made everything worth it. Life was hard, but it was beautiful. Then I lost her, the woman who was my anchor, my balance, my calm in every storm. Cancer took her slowly, painfully. I watched her disappear piece by piece while I tried to stay strong for our boy. After she passed away, the house felt empty, like the walls had forgotten how to echo laughter. I didn't have time to grieve the way a man should. I had a child who needed me. So I swallowed my pain and kept moving forward. I became mother and father. I cooked, even when I didn't know how. I braided his hair when he was young. I stitched his torn school uniforms by hand at night. I attended every school event, even when other parents laughed at my worn-out clothes. I remember skipping meals so he could eat more. I remember selling my old radio, the one my wife and I danced to, so I could pay for his textbooks. Every sacrifice I made felt worth it, because I believed he would grow up remembering love, not struggle. When he got older and wanted to study abroad, the cost was impossible. But I found a way. I sold the car I had spent 10 years saving for. I sold furniture, jewelry, memories. I told him, "Go, don't worry about me." I wanted him to fly, even if it meant I had to walk. I lived alone after that. Days turned into years. I ate simple meals, wore the same clothes, and worked in silence. The loneliness was heavy, but I kept going because I believed he would come back and say, "Thank you, Dad. I see everything you did." I waited for that moment, but life is not as poetic as our hopes. When he finally returned, he wasn't the boy I raised. He was polished, confident, successful, and cold. I saw it in his eyes. I saw it in how he talked. I saw it in how quickly he wanted to hide me from his new world. Still, I loved him. I always loved him, and maybe that was my greatest weakness. It started small, little cuts that I told myself were nothing. At first, it was the way my son would glance away when I entered a room, like I was a piece of furniture that didn't belong. Then it became jokes at my expense, whispered comments about my weight and my clothes when he thought I couldn't hear. The first time his future wife rolled her eyes while I was speaking, I felt a dull shock, as if someone had tapped my shoulder and I had turned to see a stranger. I remember freezing mid-sentence, forcing a smile, and retreating into silence. The humiliation grew. One afternoon she asked, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "Does he really live here alone? Who dresses him?" My son laughed, not gently, but the sharp laugh of someone relieved that he no longer has to claim responsibility. I felt my chest tighten. Disbelief first. How could the boy I raised stand and join their laughter while I sat there, the butt of their amusement? I kept telling myself it was a phase, a cruel joke, but each joke landed like a stone. Then came the invitations that were carefully worded to exclude me. "We're having a small engagement party, immediate family only," they said, as if the years I had spent being that family could be erased with polite wording. I showed up at the door anyway once, because old habits die slowly. She opened it and looked me up and down like a critic reading a bad review. "This isn't your scene," she said, pushing the door closed. I stood there on the step, the night air cold in my lungs, feeling as if the world had tilted, and I had missed the chair when the music stopped. The words hardened into commands. I remember the night we argued in the kitchen, the last time I thought we might salvage something. She said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "If you want to be part of our lives, you need to fix yourself. We can't be seen with someone who," and she mouthed the insult, "looks like that." My son, who used to defend me with a fury I respected, looked down and said, "Dad, she's right. People will judge us." Shock flashed across my face, then a hollow sadness. I could not believe the son I carried through nights of fever and study would barter my dignity for his ease. Humiliation became a performance at my own house. She rearranged my photos so I would not see them, put covers on my furniture, and pretended it was for aesthetic reasons. Once, she told me plainly, while folding a blanket I had bought on my first paycheck, "We don't have room for your old things anymore." "They make the place feel cheap." I felt my throat close. Disbelief turned to a slow-burning hurt that settled into my bones. I kept thinking of my wife's hands, of her laugh, of the first tiny shoes we bought for our son. And now a stranger dismissed those memories with a neat, indifferent sweep. The wedding planning was the knife. Invitations arrived with RSVP cards that had my name printed at the bottom like an afterthought. When I asked if I could help with anything, she looked at me like a doctor examines a patient with pity and said, "No, thank you. We have a planner." At the rehearsal dinner, she stood and toasted the future while I sat clapping in a corner, applauding a life I had helped build but was being shoved out of. Tears pricked my eyes and I swallowed them because the world saw me as old and weak. Crying would only confirm it. The last searing blow came on the day of the wedding. I stood in a corner, watching people mingle, feeling the old, familiar loneliness. Then, with a cruelty rehearsed, she stepped forward and announced loud enough for the whole hall, "Why is he even here? He looks like a fat pig in that tight suit." The laughter that followed was like salt in a wound. I felt my face go hot, then cold. Shock, then a wave of shame that made everything shrink. My son's eyes met mine for a second, and there was no spark of protection, only a distant, embarrassed look. My heart broke in slow, terrible pieces. At first, I could not process the layers. The abandonment. They had decided I was disposable. The greed. They wanted a life without the messiness of the past. The disrespect. My years of sacrifice reduced to a punchline. Sadness washed over me like a tide, leaving behind small, sharp stones of anger. Disbelief gave way to a simmering fury that made my hands tremble. I remember stepping outside to breathe. The the music thudding behind me like a heartbeat that wasn't mine, and feeling that something inside me had shifted from hurt to resolve. The betrayal wasn't a single moment. It was a slow dismantling of everything I thought I was to them. Provider, protector, father. They replaced me with convenience, with appearances, with people who would make their lives comfortable. As the truth settled, layer by layer, my sadness hardened into iron. The same hands that once cradled my son now pushed me away. The same home I had kept warm with love now shut its doors in my face. And as anger rose, it carried with it a terrible clarity. I would not disappear quietly. I stepped out into the corridor, and the noise of the reception became a distant tide. Dull and relentless, my hand tightened around the paper cup of water until the plastic creased under my fingers. For a long minute, I didn't know whether I was breathing or simply existing between breaths. Hall lights spilled gold across the floor, and none of it touched me. I pressed my back against the cool wall and closed my eyes, trying to summon the quiet place my wife used to find in my chest. I could still smell her, ginger tea and the faintest hint of lavender, though she had been gone for years. Grief rose first, slow and familiar. A weight I had carried since that hospital room. But this grief was different. It had edges that cut. It tasted like the hush after laughter stops and someone forgets your name. My son's face flashed before me, his small, knobby knees, the way he would fall asleep on my shoulder, and then the man who stood beside him now, polished and unbothered. The memory of her words at the wedding replayed like a cruel song, each note sharper than the last. Fat pig. The syllables landed and settled, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Shock had hit me first. Like a physical blow I still felt in my ribs. I had frozen in place, the world narrowing to the point of that insult. Then came humiliation. Hot, humiliating. Unbidden tears blurring the edges of the room. I thought of all the small sacrifices that had been folded into silence. The nights I worked 2 shifts, the meals I gave away, the coat I mended with trembling fingers. I thought of the radio I sold, the photos I boxed, the promises I made to keep the house steady. They were ordinary things, but they were everything to me. And now they were dismissed with a laugh, like crumbs swept from a countertop. Sadness swelled into disbelief. How could the son I had held through fevers trade my dignity for a cleaner reputation? I tortured myself with that question until the memory of his whisper at the wedding, "Maybe you should leave," gnawed at me like a burr under the skin. Walking away seemed the easiest thing in that moment. And I almost did it, almost let the night swallow me and my shame. But then something colder than grief began to grow, a metal taste at the back of my throat. It started as a small ember, a recognition that silence had become their convenience. I replayed every slight with a new clarity, noticing how soft cruelty had been dressed in polite tones. Each omission, every careful exclusion, was not accidental. They had planned a life without the messiness of me, and I had been too gentle to see the map of their indifference. That realization stung, but it also sharpened me. Anger sparks differently in old bones. Quieter, yes, but more relentless. I felt the hot, steady burn of it unfurl inside my chest. Grief receded into a backdrop. Anger took the stage. My hands stopped trembling and became steady, purposeful. I began to catalog everything. Dates, words, faces, the way the planner's name matched the invoices I'd found, small details that would matter later. For the first time in years, my mind was not clouded by sorrow but focused like a lens. I remembered my wife's practical voice. Don't let them take your quiet. Her words were a lifeline I hadn't known I'd need until that moment. I realized that passivity had been praised as virtue for too long. I had been patient. I had been forgiving. I had let time and circumstance wear me down. But patience had been mistaken for weakness by people who traded loyalty for appearances. Enough, something inside me whispered. It wasn't a shout, more a deep, unavoidable command from the part of me that had built things from dust. I thought of the nights I'd stayed awake balancing budgets, of the sweat that had forged my work into something real. I had sacrificed so my son could rise. I had never imagined he'd step on my dignity to reach higher. That thought hardened into resolve. I stood up straighter, feeling the old posture return, as if muscle remembered pride even when the heart had softened. Plan after plan slid into my head, small at first, then bolder, each one a way to make truth unavoidable. I didn't want petty humiliation returned. I wanted justice that would pierce the myth of their perfect life. No screams, no theatrics, just the quiet, irrevocable consequence of choices. I promised myself two things in that corridor. I would not beg for respect, and I would not be erased. My voice was low when I said it aloud to the empty air, and the echo felt like permission. Enough is enough. I would make them feel the hollow they had made in me, not with cruelty, but with the weight of truth. And in that hushed vow, something like peace settled, sharp, determined, and final. I didn't storm into revenge the way movies make men do. There was no sudden blaze of fury that made me throw plates and shout. What rose in me was colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. Patience. I sat with that fury like an old friend and listened. The plan began as a list in the back of a notebook I kept beside my bed. Dates, names, unpaid invoices, whispers I'd overheard at board meetings years ago. I wrote in a careful hand, because secrecy needs order. First, I rebuilt what they thought I had lost. I called an old lawyer I trusted, a blunt man with more ethics than social graces, and asked a simple question. What would it take to quietly acquire enough influence to make someone notice? He didn't laugh. He gave me a ledger of options: investments, proxy accounts, silent partnerships. I learned new words I hadn't used since the company I sold. Words like holding company, due diligence, and non-disclosure. Each term felt like a tool in my hand. I started small. I reconnected with a supplier I had once helped when he was young and broke. He remembered my name, and, more importantly, the goodwill I had sown into the community when I was running my factory. "You saved me," he said on the phone, and that memory unlocked a chain of favors I'd tucked away like spare change. I began pooling small investments from quiet friends, people who owed me more than they could ever repay. Not because of money, but because of what I had once done for them in the dark nights. Secrecy was a religion. I adopted a new name on bank documents, used trusted intermediaries, and created a paper trail that pointed everywhere but to me. When people asked if I had a new hobby, I smiled and said gardening. In the afternoons, I did garden. In the evenings, I read balance sheets. I learned how to watch without being seen. The brash confidence I'd once had returned, not as ego, but as craft. I also gathered information. My phone calls were precise. My lawyer and I dug into the debts and liabilities of the father-in-law's company. We found cracks, a missed shipment, an unpaid loan, a lawsuit quietly settled. Those cracks were not gossip. They were leverage. I hired an accountant on the sly, a woman sharp as broken glass, and she fed me numbers that told stories. Where the money really flowed, which board members were on the fence, who could be persuaded if the price was right. I enlisted allies I didn't broadcast. There was Raza, the old foreman who still respected the work ethic I once championed. He had a way of getting people to speak plainly in taverns and markets. There was Amina, my neighbor's niece, who worked in corporate law and loved puzzles. She reviewed documents late into the night and laughed when a loophole revealed itself. I paid them with meals and respect, not with the cold coin of humiliation. Their loyalty felt cleaner for it. Patience taught me timing. I watched the father-in-law's company stumble through a board meeting that he flattered his way through, but failed to control. I listened to his speeches and counted the pauses when his advisors exchanged nervous glances. Those pauses were opportunities. I made one anonymous bid through a holding company, then another, small enough not to alert suspicion, but large enough to be noticed by the right people. I watched their faces through the grapevine as rumors of interest began to bloom. But I never revealed the whole plan to anyone, not even to my lawyer in clear words. I revealed in fragments, testing reactions, like feeling the temperature of the room before wading in. I let the story leak in careful streams. A whispered meeting here, a contract mentioned in passing there. People fill in missing pieces with their own pride. Often, they make the tapestry of my intentions more dramatic than I intended. That drama worked for me. There were nights I rehearsed conversations I might never have, confrontations I would not stage, statements I would file, letters I would not send. I practiced calm. How to enter a room with the weight of truth rather than a demand for vengeance. I wrote speeches I never planned to give, and memos I would hand over at the correct moment. Control, I discovered, is the most devastating weapon. I also protected myself against becoming the monster I feared. I made rules. No public shaming, no illegal tricks, no gossip spread to wound. My aim was not cruelty, it was correction. I wanted consequences that matched the betrayal. A removal of the illusion, not a ruin of lives. That moral line kept me honest when the easier, meaner options presented themselves like ripe fruit. Then there were the small deceptions that felt almost childish, but effective. I pretended to decline invitations, to be sleepy or disinterested, while my intermediary quietly bought influence. I visited the office as a curious retiree, asking questions, and left with conversations that confirmed my suspicions. I ate alone at the cafe near their headquarters and let their executives overhear me talk about industry trends. Idle ears picked up what I wanted them to. Sometimes I allowed the rumor of my involvement to bloom, then recede. I would let a name surface in a conversation and watch who repeated it. That told me exactly who might flip when pressured. When the time came, I needed votes to fall into place like dominoes. Finding the right domino to push required this slow reconnaissance. There was one thing I didn't bargain for: the small, private pleasures that kept me human. A cup of tea with Raza, a laugh over a joke I'd told 100 times, a quiet nod from Amina when a document confirmed our theories. Those comforts reminded me why I hadn't acted sooner. Not from cowardice, but from the heavy cost of dismantling relationships. I wanted only to restore dignity, not to buy hollow triumph. As the pieces tightened, I rehearsed the reveal like a surgeon maps an incision. The board meeting would be the stage, not a spectacle, but a place where legal ownership could be demonstrated beyond dispute. I would not scream. I would present facts and watch the house of cards fall. But the exact moment, the way the father-in-law would see me, the silence of the room, the light catching on the papers as they were placed on the table, I kept that secret even from myself. That image lived in me and sharpened with every passing day. I knew I would have to be patient until their confidence turned to overreach. Pride makes people careless. Greed makes them predictable. I waited for the day they made the mistake that allowed me to step in with an ironclad offer. I cultivated a calm that felt like age and experience, and behind it, I readied the legal instruments that would make the truth undeniable. There are moments when secrecy feels like loneliness, and I felt it deeply. But loneliness also makes you listen. I listened to the schedule of the father-in-law's life, to who he trusted and who flattered him. I learned his weaknesses and lined up my allies at those weak points. The plan was not one single strike. It was a slow, coordinated set of gentle pressures that would leave no room for a comeback. Now, as I fold the notebook and watch the garden outside, I let the reader wonder, which paper will I lay on the table first? Which voice will I call into the witness of truth? And who will stand when the silence finally breaks? The answer is coming, but not yet. The day I chose to act, I dressed like a man people had stopped noticing. Simple shirt, old coat, shoes polished but not flashy. I walked into the father-in-law's company headquarters with my cane more for show than need, carrying a leather folder that looked like it held nothing more than papers. Nobody suspected the file contained destiny. I signed in as a guest of a small investors' meeting. Anonymity wrapped in a polite smile. My heart beat steady. This was the moment patience met precision. At the boardroom door, I met Raza and Amina, who slipped in like two shadows I'd cultivated. Raza wore the complacent face of a retired foreman. Amina carried quiet competence and a laptop that would speak louder than any accusation. We took seats at the back while the chairman made his usual grand speech about legacy and control. I listened, cataloging the faces that flinched when numbers were mentioned. Those faces had teeth I intended to blunt. My lawyer rose and produced the first twist, a sealed packet of documents marked with the company's letterhead. The room hummed, murmurs climbed. The packet contained certified purchase agreements showing that, through a chain of legal entities, I now held a controlling interest. The father-in-law, who had boasted of invincibility, went white as a sheet. He tried to interrupt, to laugh it off, but the law is a patient thing. It speaks in proofs, signatures, and timestamps. I let the silence do the rest. He stood, voice trembling, and demanded to see the buyer. I let the lawyer say what I had rehearsed only in the quiet of my kitchen. This acquisition was made through a holding company. The beneficial owner is present. I removed my coat, unbuttoned my collar, and watched his expression as recognition crawled across it like frost. There was the beat when he remembered a name, and then the beat when he refused to believe it. I did not shout. I did not gloat. I simply set the signed documents on the table and waited for the collapse. But the first twist was not all. The father-in-law tried one last trick. He claimed financial irregularities and threatened litigation. I had expected this and had mapped it. Amina connected her laptop to the screen and played back-recorded calls. Calls in which his own CFO admitted to misreporting earnings to hide debts. Calls the father-in-law thought were private. The room quieted further as colleagues watched the man they revered unravel by his own admissions. The surprise was double-edged. Not only had I taken control, but I also held the truth that exposed his incompetence and greed. The daughter, my DIL, stood and screamed accusations, trying to make me the villain. She accused me of public humiliation, of using old wounds as weapons. I looked at her calm face and remembered the kitchen and the rehearsal and the word she spat. When she demanded I leave, I handed a folder to the board and said, "Here are the employment reviews you never read, and the emails where your PR team advised silence while creditors circled." The emails bore timestamps. The PR memos bore signatures. Members of the board who had pretended ignorance shifted uncomfortably, their complicity now on paper. Then came the second twist, a strategic resignation. Two board members who had been bribed by promises of future contracts stood and stepped down, their departures triggering corporate bylaws that handed immediate interim control to the majority shareholder. Me. Their faces were pale masks of regret. The father-in-law realized, with a dizzying tilt, that his kingdom had changed hands not by drama, but by mechanism. He had been outmaneuvered by the quiet work of patient preparation. The son, my own boy, tried to plead, stumbling over words, asking how we could fix this. I listened to him with the same tenderness I had once used to mend scraped knees. But this was not about punishment for him alone. It was about truth. I told him plainly, "You chose comfort over compassion. You let them rewrite our story." His eyes filled, and for a moment I saw the child under the man he'd become. He wanted forgiveness. I wanted accountability. The difference is the shape of justice. I did not destroy them. I enforced consequences. Contracts were renegotiated, leadership changes mandated, and a compliance committee installed to audit past misdeeds. Creditors were called in and given transparent reports. The father-in-law lost the illusion of control. His public image crumpled under the weight of revealed mismanagement. The DIL's social media posts that had mocked me earlier were archived and shown as examples of the disrespect that had poisoned the culture they courted. They felt exposure, not violence, and it stung deeper than any blow I could have dealt. There were smaller satisfactions that made the revenge personal and precise. The expensive suit the DIL insisted I replace was donated to a shelter with a note about dignity. The tickets to a gala she had used to flaunt status were cancelled and redirected to a charity that supported workers the father-in-law had ignored. I had Raza organize a quiet letter to the old employees, restoring pensions that had been delayed. Each act repaired the hidden harm their pride had inflicted. They scrambled for legal recourse, of course, a predictable, feverish attempt to regain lost ground. But I had not left a single loose end. Every contingency had been counted. Contingency funds, legal backstops, witness statements collected over months. The lawsuits fizzled when the truth stood between their words and the law. The public opinion, fed by transparent disclosures, turned from pity for a fallen businessman to outrage at a man who had pretended virtue while bleeding his company dry. The final twist was the most satisfying. The father-in-law's closest advisor, the man who had whispered the worst decisions into his ear, was indicted for embezzlement after Amina handed evidence to the Attorney General. It was not my joy to see a man fall, but it was the culmination of the accountability I sought. When reporters asked me later in the lobby why I had done it, I answered simply, because someone had to make truth louder than their comfortable lies. When I walked out of that building for the last time as its majority owner, the hall was not filled with triumphant shouts. It was filled with a stunned, holy quiet. The betrayal had been answered not with cruelty, but with the unmasking of greed. I had given them consequences that matched their choices. Loss of power where they had abused it. Restoration for those they'd harmed. And a public ledger that would remind them and others what happens when dignity is sold for convenience. As I stepped into the cool light, my hands were not trembling. They were steady. I felt neither glee nor emptiness, only a hard, settled relief. The revenge was complete in its purpose. They were exposed, their lies unraveled, and the scales that had been tipped so long were set more toward balance. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a quieter rhythm. Not triumphant, not bitter, just steady. I found myself waking up earlier, brewing tea instead of coffee, sitting near the window where the morning light softened the edges of everything. Revenge doesn't come with a parade. It comes with silence, a silence I had earned. The news circulated, of course. Articles, headlines, a few dramatic interviews. People who once dismissed me now spoke my name with a cautious respect. But I didn't care for their opinions anymore. Respect that arrives after the fight is not loyalty, it's recognition of power. I learned the difference. My DIL and her father moved out of the spotlight entirely. Their social media pages dissolved into blank icons. Their grand speeches shrank into apologies whispered in courtrooms and board meetings. And my son, he came by one evening, not to argue, not to defend, but simply to sit. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did I. When he finally said, "Dad, I didn't protect you," his voice cracked, like someone admitting a truth they had been hiding even from themselves. I nodded, not in forgiveness, not in blame, just acknowledgement. We talked about small things first. Weather, neighbors, the old radio we still hadn't gotten rid of. Then slowly, carefully, we talked about the wound. He cried. I didn't. I had cried enough already, just in private places, long before any of them knew. Healing isn't a single moment. It's a slow return to yourself. I didn't take the company to build an empire. I took it to restore what they damaged. Dignity. I placed new management, reinstated pensions, and set up training programs for younger workers who had been overlooked. For the first time in years, the company wasn't a monument to ego, but a place that served people. There was peace in that, a quiet, meaningful peace. But there was also a sadness, a lingering grief for the family I thought I had. The respect I assumed was mutual. The love I believed was unconditional. Betrayal teaches you the limits of trust, but it also teaches you the strength of standing alone when you must. Some nights, I sit outside on the porch and listen to the breeze moving through the trees, and I think about that wedding day, the laughter, the insult, the sting. I think about who I was then and who I am now. I am not the man who was mocked. I am not the man who broke. I am the man who endured and acted. And the moral? It rests quietly in my chest, heavy and honest. Never let humiliation make you small. Never let others dictate your worth. Stand with dignity, even when you stand alone, because there will come a day when the ones who laughed will fall silent. And on that day, you will learn that the strongest revenge is simply reclaiming yourself.